Geopolitics and Empire is joined by Dr. Zeno Leoni, who is a lecturer and teaching fellow at the Defense Studies Department of King's College London. His research focuses on world order and hegemonic shifts, with a special interest in the hegemonic competition between U.S. and China. His latest book, recently published, is American Grand Strategy from Obama to Trump, Imperialism After Bush and China's Hegemonic Challenge. Grazie for joining the podcast. Zeno, how are things in London?
Jorge, thank you very much. All good here, all good. And there's a lot happening in London and in the rest of the world, so keeps us very busy.
Yes, indeed. All right, so maybe we can start with your book, and we were discussing, you can give us just a bit of your theoretical framework. You write that the interstate geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China has taken the shape of inter-imperial rivalry, a nuance which you say is neglected by non-Marxists. Though globalization has integrated our economies, states continue to act on geopolitical logic. You talk about hegemony, empire, the American empire, Marxist imperial theory. So before we get into the U.S.-China rivalry, perhaps tell us, what is most important for you when thinking about empire today?
Absolutely. So in my book, basically, as you alluded to, I tried to challenge this idea that the study of empire and imperialism, especially from a Marxist point of view, it couldn't focus on the military, the geostrategic aspects of foreign policy. Neo-Gramscian and others in the family of Marxists, for pretty obvious reasons, tend to focus on the economic aspect of international politics. They don't even think in terms of international politics. They think in terms of international political economy, which is great. But I tried to challenge them by trying to integrate in the theory of empire and imperialism, especially from a left-wing perspective, the idea that we can also talk about military rivalry, geopolitical rivalries, clashes between empire, inter-imperial rivalries. And I decided to do that with a highly neglected theory of imperialism, certainly a theory of imperialism that has been neglected in the last few decades. Perhaps it was more popular, in the aftermath of World War I. And this is Lenin's theory of imperialism. I always have to clarify that, at least in that pamphlet, in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, Lenin defined imperialism not as a great power subjugating or occupying, invading another country, but more as a weaker country in particular, but more as interstate rivalry. So that's how Lenin defines imperialism in that short book, in that pamphlet. And there are two very important pillars in that theory, which are very relevant in the competition between the US and China. One is, the first one is the fact that the international environment is highly competitive. Global markets are very competitive. Therefore, different multinational corporations, they try to collaborate, to cooperate with their national government, where they are originally based, in order to have political support to unlock opportunities in the international system. That's very crucial. We shouldn't believe the myth of free market, at least not all the time. Sometimes, very often, these companies, big businesses, cooperate with their governments and compete in the international arena. For example, take France and the fact that it got very upset because it was left out of AUKUS. There was a specific case of the French government trying to push hard to promote its strategic industries. That's why they were very upset. So that's what we're talking about. And this is one pillar of Lenin's theory of imperialism. The other pillar is about the fact that great powers rise and fall. And they rise and fall because wealth circulate, moves around, and capital always live. They go from one country to another in search of economic opportunities, in search of better deals or better conditions for lucrative businesses. And this is what's behind the fact that this is what's behind globalization and the rise and fall of the decline of the US and the rise of China. And so with these two pillars, Lenin tries to explain that, this is why countries go to war, essentially, or go to war or compete in the international arena in order to recreate those conditions of profitability, in order to promote their company, their strategic companies. And I think this is a good picture, good way of framing what is going on between the US and China.
And maybe then again, before moving ahead, taking a look at the state of the U.S. today. In your book, you've said that you don't think American grand strategy was ever really isolationist, that it oscillated between full and selective engagement in international affairs. But now the unipolar moment is over, and supposedly it will be more difficult for the U.S. to engage the world. You say that the world order is transitioning toward an uncertain structure, but with features that are unfavorable to the United States compared to the immediate post-Cold War era. What comes next for America as a declining superpower? We see internally there are a lot of cultural, socio-cultural, political divisions. Economically, it's not doing well. And then we've seen the retreat from Afghanistan. In the eyes of the world, America seems weak now, and other countries are becoming more confident and aggressive, Russia, China, Iran, and so on. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to take a step back first, because as you say, yes, the unipolar moment, the liberal international order is in a crisis. But actually, one of the points I always try to make very, very vocally is also in the book on American grand strategy from Obama to Trump, is that the liberal international order since the end of World War II has worked fairly well, fairly conveniently for the United States. It was beneficial to the United States. Why? Because the United States had a very competitive, advanced technological economy. And so they had an interest in exporting, in opening up the world economy. They had an interest in free market and international rule of law because it was convenient to their very competitive multinational corporations. There is and this is the story of the liberal international order until more or less Trump, if you want. But there is a flaw, there is a limit in the strategy. You cannot have a global order. You cannot promote globalization if you don't have other countries, other economies acting as locomotives of this world, of this global order. To put it in a simple way, who do U.S. companies sell to if there's nobody buying? Essentially, that's the point. And so, in order to achieve that, the U.S., we have seen it many times in history, they had to encourage other countries, other great powers to rise, to develop, to open up, to become, part of the family of the liberal international order. And this is where all the problems with China began. And this is when, China started to develop, started to somehow imitate the United States in a very efficient way. And it has become a competitor of the US nowadays. And we'll talk about that later on. But so what's going on with the liberal international order now? The problem is that it doesn't work efficiently as it used to work. It doesn't benefit anymore the US as it used to. There are too many competitors, especially from an economic point of view. And the US is unable, and we see this in the crisis of the World Trade Organization, is unable at enforcing, free market rule of law. We see this in the many failed negotiations within the WTO, and this somehow explains the Obama administration, but above all, the anger of the Trump administration, because it's the Trump administration that realized that the liberal international order wasn't anymore convenient as it used to be for the United States. And so, yes, we have been entering a phase of transition. I think many agree that will last probably about 20 years, perhaps, who knows? And definitely it's taking us towards a post-American order. I think we are already there. It's difficult to say whether this will be a multipolar order, whether it will be a bipolar order, so a U.S. China thing. Some people talk about apolarity, so no real hegemon, and they say this is concerning. Others talk about a multiplex order, so the overlap of different features, authoritarian and liberal features in the international order. Certainly, it's an order which will have less stability compared to the unipolar moment of the 90s, where there was an hegemon who could impose its will over the others in the international system.
So you touched on it, and it was my next question. Anyways, you write about China as a crucial partner and strategic enemy. Yeah. You've said that China initially was, benefiting from the help of the West, that America helped China become a superpower, but China decided to strategically remain sovereign and independent, opening up economically, but never politically, as some other countries have done, and perhaps in that way, some of those countries became, vassals of the U.S. But China has resisted that, and you've said that both Washington and Beijing want to be global capitalist players, yet they want to do so based on rules that help them further their national interests. So, what are your thoughts on the U.S.-China economic and as well as this political relationship, and the idea of decoupling, and because I think this is part of the roots of the tensions that we're getting now.
Yes. So I make this argument that the U.S. and China are best friends and worst enemies at the same time. So especially China is the U.S. best friend in the sense that it has been the locomotive, as I said, of that global economy that was so crucial for the U.S. economy ultimately. But it's also that China has become also the U.S. worst enemy for different reasons. First of all, because it has become very successful, especially it is becoming successful in some highly sensitive, highly strategic areas of technologies and industries. And it has achieved this success, let's say in quotation marks, cheating on the U.S. sponsored, international rule of law. In a way, it's a bit unfair to say cheating in a way, but here we need to understand that there are two truths that we struggle to reconcile. On the one hand, China is saying we don't want to respect those rules because they were established by the United States. They're convenient for the United States. We want to challenge them. Absolutely true. So this is one side of the coin. And this is why China has this selective approach to globalization. It only wants to open up where it is convenient, where it's strong, where it's not strong, where it's not ready to compete. It keeps to protecting its industries. On the other hand, the West, the US, has always communicated to China somehow that they expected China to democratize, to liberalize, and this hasn't happened. And so, these are two fair, legitimate claims on both sides. Why we cannot reconcile the two? Because ultimately, the liberal international order is a strange beast. We have the international system of states on the one end, which overlaps with a spatial transnational network of flows, of economic flows. And there are a lot of tensions. It's difficult, it's impossible to reconcile the state interest with economic interest. Sometimes it's not always possible. And this is also why China has become such a great dilemma. However, please just allow me to add one final thought, because you asked me about the evolution of this relationship between the US and China. The US, at different junctions, the US had the opportunity to, the US made many mistakes when it comes to China, because it was always driven by this idea of opening up, by this idea of globalizing. And we find this in the Clinton administration. Bill Clinton National Security Advisor, Anthony Lake, said after the Cold War, we need to give up containment, we need to focus on enlargement. And there are many examples like this one in the history of US-China relations. And the US has always had this belief that China was democratizing, but China has never said that. The four objectives of Deng Xiaoping's were all about, making China a great country, a developed country. They never mentioned democracy. And you can also see that in the resolution that the Chinese Communist Party prepared about Mao. The Cultural Revolution was condemned, but the legacy, the fact that China had inherited this Chinese Communist Party, which could control the strategic levers of power, the strategic levers of society, that was never condemned. That was actually acknowledged as the greatest legacy of Mao. And this upsets the United States very much, because the US would like China to privatize its economy. Because if China was to privatize its economy would be more vulnerable to Western companies, right? Which nowadays continues to be stronger in international markets. And this is a weakness of China.
Yeah, so we talked a little bit about kind of the strength and weakness of the U.S. The U.S. empire is declining now. Kind of to take a quick look at China. In a recent talk you gave online, and I'll include the link in the description, you highlighted some fascinating information, how the U.S. wasn't paying attention, and how China's GDP grew 12 times that of the U.S. and China's military spending grew 16 times that of the U.S. And I think already now China's navy surpassed in quantities has surpassed America. So how weak or strong do you view China today, politically, economically, or in total?
Okay, so first of all, on the overtake or on the rise of China. So at the end of the Cold War, when the US decides to give up containment and focus on enlargement, on globalization, the mantra was Francis Fukuyama's end of history. This idea of end of history, we find it's a general idea, but we find it in different areas. In terms of strategic studies, it was translated as, with this expression, the strategic pause. So there was this idea that the enemies of the West had been defeated. And so we could focus on different things, on enjoying life, perhaps. Edward Luttwak, the strategist, said, we don't worry about international security anymore. Let's focus on the geoeconomy of international politics. And so this is the beginning of what I called the strategic oversight of China's rise. Essentially, we decided not to look at that because we thought it was convenient. Why it was convenient? Clinton was committed to bring China inside the World Trade Organization. Again, for that, because we needed to globalize the liberal order. And so, just to make a long story short, that's how we, all of a sudden, let's say, at some point halfway through the past decade, the 2010s, we realized that actually China had not only modernized, we knew that, but that it also had a very powerful military. And according to military analysts, China nowadays, it's capable of winning a short-term conflict within the first island chain. So to answer your question, how strong is China? Well, in a way, it's very strong because that first island chain, unfortunately or fortunately, lies on a very highly strategic region or corner of the world, the South China Sea, which is crucial to global trade. So in that sense, China is very strong, has been weaponizing those atolls, those islands, the Spratly Islands. And so I think what analysts, we don't know that for sure, but analysts believe that China has already a military advantage there. However, on the other hand, China is still, from a military point of view, still weak in the sense that beyond that confined geopolitical region, China doesn't have what military analysts would call power projection, forward base. China, to make an example, would struggle to deal with even a small conflict in the Indian Ocean with another, I don't know, with India, with the U.S, with NATO, but that's not a problem for China. They're not going to war, far from home, and I think this speaks very much about China's weaknesses and strength. China, in my view, will never take any irrational or rushed military decision, action, like going to war far from its borders, because they know they're not there yet. They have only 2 carriers. These are not good quality compared to what they will build or compared to what the West have. But at the same, so this is a strength. This is Sun Tzu kind of thinking, win without fight. But at the same time, this hides also a weakness, and the weakness is that China is not ready to go to war with the West.
Yeah, that's some good analysis. I agree. And in terms of technology, switching gears a bit, and the new Cold War, we have a lot of issues. We have the industrial policies highlighted in attempts to ban Huawei and such, and there's the threat of espionage, spying, surveillance. And for me, something that is important is the digital authoritarianism, which we see in China with its kind of dystopian social credit system. And I feel that this is spreading now in the West, censorship, deplatforming. And what is important for you when thinking about big tech, Silicon Valley technology in the U.S. China Cold War?
Thank you. So first of all, you said this is spreading in the West, right? I think I don't know exactly what you meant by this, but what this tells me really is that China. We realized that China is this somehow successful model of government controlling the levers of powers. And now we see in the West, in the US, in the UK, a debate about approaching these issues, especially strategic technologies, with the whole of government or cross-government, pan-government approach. So it means that, as many people, for example, I've recently seen that on Foreign Affairs, on the Foreign Affairs Journal, we have realized that the Chinese model somehow, although we don't like it, it is successful, especially when it comes to these issues. And somehow within democratic boundaries, we're trying to imitate that. But it's a dangerous territory, and I don't know to what extent we can remain democratic when it comes to certain technology, when it comes to surveillance, and so on. But that's something that really I find fascinating, the fact that this is a very important strategic victory for China. The fact that we are managing economic issues in a more centralized, politically centralized way. So we are looking at them. We don't say that, but we admire them somehow. Let's put it that way. While the Silicon Valley is central to UK-China relations, it's because the Silicon Valley represents, the present and above all the future of next generation's technologies. And I've read many statements from Obama, from Trump, from U.S. policy circles. There is this belief, but this is the same in China. That's pretty much the same. There is this belief that if you want to be the economic and military hegemon, if you want to be, the world leader, you need to master those kind of strategic technologies. First of all, because we're talking about an economic sector that gives you a lot of money. and also because it's an economic sector that also gives you power. So if you have a bank, you only have a lot of money. But if you own Google, you have money, but also control, right? So, and I mean, the Silicon Valley is also, it's where, the future of also future weapons will develop, and artificial intelligence and so on. So this is really central. And the Silicon Valley and, technological success ties into international rule of law and free market, which we discussed at the start of this conversation. The Silicon Valley is still very much more competitive than Chinese companies in this sector, apart from Huawei and Zoom now is coming up. And so the US wants to maintain those free market rules that have been in place since the end of World War II, because those rules continue to protect and to guarantee the success of these these American corporate, giants. And you also see many times statements from both Obama and Trump saying, we need to protect, especially from Obama, we need to protect those rules that have made us great. We cannot let China impose those rules on different rules on us. And of course, China has all the interest to undermine those free market rules, because China conducts business in a different way. It's more state-led. And so this is really the core of the rivalry between the US and China. This is why Obama, first with the TPP, and then Trump with the trade war, tried to take on China. The TPP and the tariffs are two very different tools in foreign economic policy. The TPP is multilateral. The tariff, the trade war was bilateral, confrontational. But they were both trying to compel China, to force China to privatize a little bit more its economy, which is in some strategic areas still very much controlled by the state.
You mentioned Google. So if you're Google as well, you own a bank. I think 2 weeks ago was reported that Google is now trying to create its own financial or banking ecosystem. So that's getting dangerous, that concentration of power. Before I continue with some of my questions, maybe to ask you, what are some other important or pressing points for you when thinking about this new Cold War, U.S. China, geopolitics, or international relations today?
Yeah, I think perhaps this might be of interest to your audience, to our audience today. This new Cold War tends to be framed as a clash between democracies, a democracy and an authoritarian country. I think we are really, from a Western perspective, this is, we're making a big mistake, because we continue to look at international affairs through the lenses of that divide. There's democracy, and then there are authoritarian regimes, and that's it. And it's a very black and white way of looking at these things. I think it prevents us from understanding what is China. The main issues with China is not that it's an authoritarian country. The main issue is that China is that it's a nationalist country. Not that it's a communist country, but that it's a nationalist country. And also we continue to offer this, I think, misplaced analysis. I think there's a misunderstanding. It's not really about values. It's more about economic and technological competition. Obviously, this is related to values, because when we talk about value, then this ties into international rules, international regimes, and multilateralism. So values are an instrument here for the West. They have been an instrument for the West, for the US to compete with China. But I think we need to be a little bit more realistic. We should go back to Kissinger. I think that's a very important point that needed to clarify. Perhaps I just want to add that there are interesting similarities with the Cold War. and interesting differences. What are the differences? Well, we are not in a bipolar international order yet. Why we're not in a bipolar order? Because the US and China, although they try to influence other countries, they don't have the same command, the same influence that the US and the Soviet Union used to have. And also, this is different from the old Cold War because there's very much economic interdependence between the two rivals. But why I think is very similar is because, the implications of this relationship are global. They have implications they touch on every industry, they touch on every region of the world. COVID, there's so much going on between them. It's really difficult to conduct foreign policies these days. Let's say if you are Italy, France, Mexico, Australia, very difficult to conduct foreign policy while not feeling squeezed by what's going on between the US and China. So this is always a factor in every important decision. So in that sense, I think we can say it's a new type of Cold War.
And maybe to take a look at the Middle East, you wrote a piece a year ago on the Gulf, where saying it's becoming a proxy in the U.S. China new Cold War. We've seen Israel and China especially getting cozy with China's entry into the port at Hafta, which is angering Washington. We've seen Saudi Arabia begin to kind of look away from the U.S. and look towards China's strategic partner, Russia, for military and security aspects. What are your thoughts on the Middle East and China?
Sure. So, and this gives me a chance to link back to some of the things we said. So, first of all, I think the Gulf in general is going through a transition. This very much relates to the global transition. So the Gulf countries, they have realized that the balance of power is changing, and especially that the US is less committed to the region because, it doesn't have a direct national security interest. Not that it doesn't have any interest, but it's not direct in the region. Right now, the priority is China, is the Indo-Pacific. They've said it in all possible ways. And the Gulf monarchies, they've realized that. And so they've started to become more cozy with Russia and China. And so also in the region, we see the kind of multipolarity somehow taking shape. And then that's one factor. The other factor is the new Cold War between the US and China. There is a lot of pressures from both parties on Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Israel. Actually, I've learned about that when talking to European Union diplomats who operate in the region. They told me, it's becoming quite frustrating, quite difficult to conduct our job because we always need to think in terms of, okay, what is the US or what is China going to think? And so that's part of the politics in the region. Israel, the case of Israel is not different from the case of Italy, the case of the UK, the case of South Korea. These days, you tend to find the security establishment in every Western country, which tends to be more pro-US and so more concerned about China. But then you find very influential business interests, business community, which, they lobby very hard in order to do business with China. And also, this has to be said, we live in a time of austerity, especially in Europe. And so the Chinese come in with money. It's very difficult to say, no, thank you, I don't want to use your money to build this railway or whatever. And so this creates a lot of tensions also domestically and not only between the US and its partners.
I wanted to get your thoughts on the media information war aspect. Just over the last year or two or three, perhaps, it's been fascinating for me, kind of as an observer, to watch the evolution of Chinese media, Chinese diplomats, officials, and Chinese pundits on social media. They seem to have really upped their game and polished their Twitter and other social media accounts and news agencies, including outlets such as Global Times. They're speaking very confidently and very aggressively, returning, in the media to the West, kind of an eye for an eye. What are your thoughts, kind of, on the media war between the U.S., China, and someone like yourself who observes and reads the from both sides, the consuming the information?
Right. So different thoughts. Well, on the media war, this tells you that really that's why we talk about a new type of Cold War, in the sense that this is everywhere. And another aspect that is very similar to the old Cold War is the fact that there is this commitment to delegitimize the adversary in everything that the adversary does. I can see this on both sides. So I think this was one of the first things that made me think this really sounds like a new Cold War. So that's important. That's part of the picture. I think is not helpful at all when it comes to diplomacy. It's striking that the U.S. and China, despite how important this relationship has become, despite all the tension, don't really have a deal, like a diplomatic deal, a diplomatic pact. And I think it's really very much time to do that. Perhaps on information, misinformation, I think China is ahead of the game. But this has very much to do with how, again, we go back to this Sun Tzu philosophy. So Sun Tzu was all about, he wrote about the art of war, and win without fight. That's the mantra for Chinese policymakers. And so that's why the cognitive environment, the cognitive domain, nowadays that we talk a lot about multi-domain, right now the military institutions in the West are studying this idea of multi-domain. So the cognitive element, the cognitive environment has become, very central. China is probably 20 years ahead of us. I say 20 years because in 1999, two Chinese colonels from the Air Force wrote a book, a pamphlet titled Unrestricted Warfare. So that's how they see competition. It goes way beyond, a military clash, which instead is what in the West, which is closer to the tradition of Clausewitz, we see as more relevant. So we always look for that smashing ultimate victory. This is not what China is looking for. China is trying to make small gains here and there, and by mastering the cognitive domain, they're playing the game. They're doing it very well. We saw a bit of that during the pandemic crisis in Italy, as China was delivering masks and medical equipment, and doctors were coming to Italy. They were very good at choreographing, showcasing over Twitter, Facebook, with different, even institutional accounts, how good they were. And it's all relative. Of course, you might say, this is all normal. They're providing helps, and fine. But this triggered an alarm within the Italian Parliament, and we have a committee on working on intelligence, and they wrote a report titled. The title was referring to infodemic during the COVID pandemic. So. Yes, I mean, this is very much, I think this is one of the tools that China uses to increase its influence.
Was basically playing the long game, sort of like death by 1,000 cuts. Taiwan. So we're seeing a great increase in news coverage, especially aggressive commentary from both the Chinese side and the West on Taiwan, from both Chinese government officials, Chinese media such as Global Times, and the same from the West. It seems almost as though something is about to break on Taiwan, that we may see some action. You've said that as China's military power has grown over the last 2 decades at a really fast pace, the United States has lost command of the commons in a highly strategic region such as the Western Pacific. You recently wrote a piece on Taiwan's, quote, porcupine doctrine, which involves a set of escalating options that acknowledge China's proximity to the Taiwanese coast. The idea, according to the Defense Review, is to resist the enemy on the opposite shore, attack it at sea, destroy it in the littoral area, and annihilate it on the beachhead, end quote. You also recently tweeted Gideon Rachman's piece in the Financial Times, which correctly says that the moment of truth over Taiwan is getting closer. Your thoughts on Taiwan and scenarios regarding it, and whether we might be getting close to the moment of truth.
Thank you. Also, thank you for monitoring all my activities. That's I'm very happy. Thank you. I'm very grateful. Yes, I think. I just don't. Given what we have been saying so far about how China operates, and given that China, behind its strengths in the way it engages with the West, actually it hides quite a few weaknesses. One that we mentioned, military weaknesses. I don't see China as willing to make that step if it's not brought to take that step. And then I'll explain about that. First of all, when we talk about Taiwan, as I tried to explain on that blog, it's not an easy business. It's actually very difficult. I sit, every day in conversation with my military students, and we always repeat that you can bomb the hell out of a country, but until you bring troops on the ground, until you control what's going on there, until you get to know the country, until you take the chance to gain some consensus among the population in whatever way, you cannot control a chunk of land, you cannot control another country. And Taiwan knows that. And so when in the first decade of this century, they were realizing that China was growing from a military point of view too fast, that it was pointless for Taiwan to try to fight and win China. And so they shifted to this porcupine doctrine, which essentially is guerrilla warfare, the weapon of the weak. It relies on early warning networks, as you said, guerrilla at sea, and then above all on the fact that Taiwan has a very mobilizable or mobilized society with a lot of reserves, a very urbanized context, difficult geography. So the ultimate defense for Taiwan is making the life of the Chinese military impossible when it comes to stepping on the island, and also imposing human and political costs so that China, in order to undermine political and moral resolve and consensus in mainland China, which is actually something that the Chinese Communist Party is very concerned with. So that's what it is about. And so I just don't see that happening. However, I'm a little concerned that all these trips, all these passages through the strait, British warships, French warships, the U.S. aircraft carrier between Taiwan and Japan over the last few days, I'm concerned that this is going to make China nervous. And I think, and that's let's say a provocative question I want to share with everyone, we really need to think about why are we talking so much about Taiwan these days? Why are we concerned about Taiwan? What is at stake for us? And do we need to protect Taiwan? I guess depending on where you live in the world, there will be different answers. But, and it's very important, for me, it's very important that the Taiwanese decide for their future. But I'm just saying, we need to think twice before we get involved in something that perhaps might escalate, and to what extent that is our fight.
Yeah, I have basically one more question for you, and it's related to that region. And we have this new security pact between Australia, UK, US. You mentioned it, AUKUS. For me, this seems to be preparation for war with China, perhaps not imminently, but at some future point, using Australia as a jumping off point, which would also designate Australia as a target for China. And they're talking about nuclear submarines, nuclear weapons. Your thoughts on AUKUS?
Yes, so I'd like to say that when AUKUS came out, I was at an Indo-Pacific symposium in Oxford University. There were people from government, colleagues, experts in the region, especially the Indo-Pacific experts. They were very excited about it. I had the feeling that it was a bit of a, they were thinking, wow, this is a game changer. This is an important development. Personally, I was a little less excited, let's put it that way, for different reasons. First of all, the US and the UK already have military strategic pacts with Australia. And I mean, we know that the UK and the US are always going to try to rescue somehow Australia if it was in trouble. I felt there was a bit of showmanship. For example, Boris Johnson here in London made it all about jobs for the British people. Perhaps he was also afraid to mention China. There is also that. Biden, I guess, he wanted to demonstrate resolve and the fact and showing that the US is close to allies in the region. Certainly, for Australia, there is a strategic concern. These days, Australia has a lot of problems because China is restricting imports from Australia, so there are concerns within the business community. So for Australia, it's a bit different. There is a lot going on, and so they want to be ready for whatever comes next. But another reason for which I was a bit skeptic, it's the fact that these submarines will be delivered in 2034. And I understand that this is only the first one will come in 2034, others will come afterwards. So I just see a contradiction, a disconnect between the urgency of the China problem, which is a problem from a very, very neutral point of view. It is a big issue, the rise of China in many ways, and the slow pace of delivery of these submarines. Although, of course, military procurement, I've learned, is a very long-term business. So perhaps this is just as soon as it could be. But yeah, I mean, we'll have to see how this develops. So far, it's still early stage, and the contract is not in place yet. There was only a diplomatic agreement, so we'll see. But it was very interesting instead for me, the crisis with the French government. I suspect, well, to me, AUKUS, first of all, is a symptom of the fact that there are a lot of problems within NATO. And especially, we increasingly see it more and more on the news. We see debates about whether the future of Atlantic security will have to be transatlantic, so NATO, or will have to be with a US-led framework and with a EU military framework on the other hand. So we know France and Germany are wondering about a EU military union. The US opposes that. Historically, the US has always opposed that. To me, AUKUS is a symptom of that there is a divide. Please just allow me to conclude that divide within NATO is another symptom of something bigger, which is the fact that perhaps we are slowly walking into a post-Western world. And the rise of China plays an important role in this post-Western world because China, with its economic, financial charm, appeal, it's creating a lot of divisions within the transatlantic or Western coalition. We have seen that at the G7, where Biden tried to convince allies that Build Back Better better world should be mostly about China. But other allies in Europe, they were like, okay, take it easy. We need, first of all, to rebuild after COVID. We don't want to make it just about China because they have a less hawkish approach towards Beijing. So there's really a lot going on. And we started from, you asked me questions about the unipolar moment. Well, it looks very different from those days. It looks much more fragmented, the geopolitical panorama.
All right. I think you wrapped it up very well. You are on Twitter I like your Twitter handle, at Multipolar Order. And apart from your new book, which was published in the spring, is there any website or project you wish to recommend to us?
Right. I would love to. Well, first of all, I'm writing a short book about China and the West, which is all about everything. I take this excuse of, everything we got wrong about China in the West, also to talk more in general about some problems of the West. And one of the most important themes is the fact that we sold our strategic soul in the name of neoliberalism, in the name of finance, in the name of making profits. We stopped thinking long term. And then we have the rise of China, the climate crisis, the jobless society. So we really need to get better at that. And so China has a lot of lessons for us. That's why I find it fascinating. Perhaps I'd like to tell you that I'm part of an association called It's Verona. And yeah, we do a lot of things. Please do get in touch, do check out our website. We have 60 interns. We talk about international security from every point of view. So it's very inclusive. Every perspective is welcome. And I'd love to share with you the actual website. I don't know if I can do it later, perhaps.
I'll include, I think I've seen it. I'll include the link in the description. Don't worry about that. I'm good with that stuff. And so, yeah, all right. Do follow Zeno on his Twitter. Check out his book. He's got a very good geopolitical informed analysis. And actually, King's College, these days I don't follow so much the university academic world, but King's College is one of the few institutions I follow on Twitter. I like the work that they do, analysis that they do. And so, grazie for being on Geopolitics and Empire.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. I wish I could say thank you in Croatian. I need to get better at that.
Hvala, they say.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this Geopolitics and Empire podcast interview. The website is geopoliticsandempire.com, and I encourage you to sign up for the free email list through which you can receive an update of every new podcast, as well as a long list of key news headlines once a week. We're being heavily censored. YouTube has deleted some of our videos, and we currently have one strike. Patreon has terminated our account. Facebook has restricted our page, and Reddit has been deleting posts. Our favorite social media channels are Telegram and Twitter. The best places to watch the podcast beyond YouTube are on Odyssey, BitChute, and Brighteon. The best places to listen to the podcast are on SoundCloud, Apple, Spotify, Google, or on any other podcast app. To help keep this podcast alive, leave a review on Apple Podcasts and wherever else. Subscribe to all our platforms and leave a donation if possible via Subscribestar, PayPal, Bitcoin, or Ethereum. You can also find us on MeWe, Minds, Gab, Float, VK, LinkedIn, and Instagram. Thanks for listening.